Hello, my name is Justin Reash, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society. And today I am joined by Iain Mansfield of the Policy Exchange to discuss the Policy Exchange's History Matters project in a recent poll regarding Winston Churchill. Iain, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
And to begin, the Society has an international audience with many members in North America, and they may not be completely familiar with the Policy Exchange. Can you just briefly tell us what the Policy Exchange is, and then dovetail into the History Matters project?
Absolutely. So Policy Exchange we are a non-partisan educational charity which exists to inform the policy landscape in government and in terms of the wider political landscape. We work on a wide variety of matters, everything from sort of health, education, foreign affairs, defence. But what we're here to talk about today is our History Matters project. This project was set up a couple of years ago. It's chaired by Sir Trevor Phillips, a very distinguished individual, and its aim is to produce an authoritative documentary record of how history is changing or being asked to change in our public spaces in society. So this could include disputes over statues, over street names, public opinion of how things should be displayed in museums or elsewhere. And what we're aiming to do is we are aiming to shed some light on this subject, because sometimes things have been very emotive and there's been a lot of sort of shouting on both sides sometimes, and also to try and chart a way forward which preserves our national history, but also is open to adding to that history where there are perhaps elements of it which perhaps not have been told as well as they could have been in the past.
Before I ask you about this new poll that was conducted in October, and specifically about its question regarding the legacy of Sir Winston Churchill, I would like to ask you, I'd like to read a statement from the report to you, and then just get, have you expand a bit. So this statement is, quote, "At present, the evidence confirms that history is the most active front in a new culture war, and that action is being taken widely and quickly in a way that does not reflect public opinion or growing concern over our treatment of the past." I would agree with that statement. And it seems like your polling, as that statement says, reflects a sense of uneasiness around the pace in which, this historical culture war, to use your phrase, is happening. And can you maybe, from your individual or from the Policy Exchange point of view, can you tell us why the pace has quickened so much in what I feel like is the past year?
That's right. And I think one thing I would say is that it seems to have slowed down a bit again in the UK, at least, which is a positive development, actually. One of the things that we've been advocating for is that these things are taken with proper consultation, with proper consideration, and where, say, the local community is consulted. And one of the things that has been found is that where there have been polls or consultations done, in general, the public has been very in favour of keeping statues. So there was a poll about Sir Francis Drake, for example, and whether to take down his statue, the famous seafarer who defeated the Spanish in 1588. And the public came back and said, no, we want him to stay. Now, the public is also very open to adding new statues. So there was a recent statue unveiled in Leicester about Sikh soldiers who had fought in the world wars, who had, these are soldiers from India whose contribution had been underlooked. And people are very supportive of that. What they'll say is that by all means, yes, if there's some stuff here which we haven't been taught about, but hasn't been celebrated, put that up. Or if we need a bit of context around something, then yes, by all means, let's do that. But don't take away things, don't take away names, don't take away our history. And that's something which we're beginning to see. I would say it's by no means settled, but we're beginning to see more openness towards that sort of approach now, which is very positive. What our poll would say, though, and particularly this one recently about Churchill, is that you have attitudes amongst the very young, and by the very young, I mean under 25, which do seem very different from the rest of the population. And this isn't something where you've got sort of, boomers in retirement homes thinking one thing and everyone else thinking the other. This is where even if you look at people in their late 20s, they have much more in common with older cohorts in society than this very young generation of school leavers. And that does point to something, and that may be one reason which is driving some of this debate, because you have a new cohort with some very different attitudes to previous generations.
Well, let's get into the survey, and the first question on the survey, and for those listening to this conversation, we'll have a link to the survey so you can learn for yourself. But the first question says, which of the following comes closest to your view of Churchill? And allow me to read the options. 1, I have a largely positive view of Churchill. For me, the good things he did outweigh the bad. 2, I have a mixed view of Churchill. For me, the good and bad things he did largely balance each other out. 3, I have a largely negative view of Churchill. For me, the bad things he did outweigh the good. 4, prefer not to say. 5, don't know. Can I ask why did you choose Churchill? You could have chosen Thatcher, you could have chosen anyone. Why from British history did you choose Churchill?
Yeah. So I think Churchill is in some ways a sort of touchstone figure. It gives you a sense of what is happening. Thatcher is still in living memory of a lot of people. She is deeply partisan, highly political figure. It would be like for your audience, asking a question about Ronald Reagan, for example.
Yes, very good.
It doesn't quite work in that way. And then there are other things. So we also in the same survey, we did ask other questions. So we asked a question about the British Empire, and that we saw similar results coming from the generation. But the British Empire is a complex subject. It went on for a couple of hundred years. They did all kinds of things. Some of them were good, some of them were pretty bad. There's economic, social, cultural, and a lot of people just feel they don't know that much about it. Whereas Churchill is a figure. Everyone almost in the UK has heard of Churchill. He's extremely famous. And as recently as 2 decades ago, he was voted in a major poll done for the BBC. He was voted the greatest Briton in all history. Interestingly, in that poll, each of the historical figures had a sort of celebrity champion, as it were, and Churchill was nominated by a former Labour cabinet minister and MP. And so the fact that we had a left-wing MP, it was Mo Mowlam. As little as 2 decades ago, it was very normal for a politician on the left to put forward Churchill as the greatest Briton in history, and then they won this vote against all sorts of other great figures. And then now, 2 decades later, we're at this situation where those under 25 are almost evenly split between whether they have a positive or a negative view of it. And just to give an indication of how that changes, if we look at those over 65, there it's completely one way. So more than 10 times as many have a positive view of him as a negative. But even if we look at the sort of 25 to 35 cohort, so only a little bit older, even there, 4 times as many have a positive view as have a negative view. So you suddenly have this shift there. And Churchill is, we can see this, we can see the same trends happening on all sorts of other questions, but Churchill, just because of his status as an iconic touchstone figure, it can bring out those changes more. I guess the other thing I would say is it is a bit more worrying in a way, because I can see, I can completely see how someone could have a negative view of the British Empire, or how we can have debates from some of our more controversial figures in history, such as Cecil Rhodes, who has a statue which wants to bring it down. But to say this about Churchill, who, if it wasn't for Churchill, we'd have been living under the Nazis. And, he led us through the war, he defeated Hitler. This is emblematic. The fact to have a negative view of him seems very odd. I guess to put it in US terms, I think I can understand a lot more how people in the US might be having debates about statues of Confederate generals, but it would seem very odd if they wanted to take down a statue of George Washington, for example.
Well, there are those people who do exist.
They do indeed, but they do. But it is a different category of figure. Really.
Well, I mean, to your point, it's very interesting. The Churchill Society, we, as unsurprising to hear this from anyone. We have a great net positive that Churchill, we have a point of view that Churchill had a great net positive on his time in the world.
Mm.
Of course, a man not without flaws, like all of us, without, points of view that we would feel, right now are wrong, but not deliberately malicious in any way.
Yeah.
And what I find fascinating is, and maybe this is our divide across the pond, we although we're an international nonprofit, the majority of our members are North American, and we find it, our UK membership is smaller than our North American membership. And so my question is, do you think, like you just said, you're surprised that Churchill of all people would be considered this way because he won the war and he defeated the Nazis? Do you think his accomplishments are either taken for granted in the UK, or are they just seen as part of the furniture, in the sense that, yeah, of course, he led us in our time of greatest need, at least in the past, 3 centuries. Why do you think there's this sense of creeping sense of, oh, actually, he was a really bad guy?
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive point you say about the taking for granted. And of course, we are now coming into generations who don't have that one generation, or that sort of word of mouth contact with people who fought in the Second World War, who served in the home front. So for people of my generation, we all knew grandparents for whom the war was very, very real. For those who are leaving school now, just the passage of time means it moves out of history, and people forget just quite how terrible a thing it was, and quite how easily it could have gone the other way in 1940. And in fact, many people, would have, the natural thing to do would have been to make peace, but it was Churchill's leadership which actually turned that around. I guess the other thing which we do have now is we have this sense in which people are judged by the single worst thing they said, and that somehow seemed to be emblematic of their achievements. But what we have to remember about Churchill is that he first became an MP when Queen Victoria was on the throne in 1900. He was an MP for over 60 years. I mean, it would be equivalent to if you had someone now who was a senator who had first become a senator in 1960. And we just imagine how much the world has changed. Yeah, and you take any senator's speeches from the 1960s, even the most noble, and you put them in the context of 2022, and they're going to sound a bit out of place. And of course, Churchill, over this period, a period in which Britain and the world went through tremendous political, sociological, economic changes, of course, you can find things that he said over 60 plus years as a member of parliament which ring badly to modern sensibilities. But that doesn't change the fact that had it not been for Churchill, we would all be living under the Nazis now, and you would have had mass slaughter and many, many other terrible things. And his leadership in that matter sort of overwhelms what he may have said in the speech and at a random point.
Yeah, and to your point, by choosing that one quote and saying this is emblematic of one person's point of view for a lifetime of 90 years, it's not only unfair to yourself in the sense intellectually, but it's unfair to those who, want to study history, want to get a holistic picture of a complicated individual living in a complicated time. And do you think that, can you extrapolate any judgments, if possible, with these respondents, under the age of 24 or 22 or whatever? Is it schooling? Is it just general interests, of maybe history just isn't a big interest anymore? Although I used to think that, and now I work at George Washington University as well. We have a physical National Churchill Leadership Center there. And some of the young people I work with are incredibly interested in history and they're incredibly well-versed in history. So is there anything you can potentially pinpoint in terms of why this creep is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly a sign of change. I would agree. There's still a huge interest in history, and we see that in topics that are discussed, attendance at museums. All sorts of indicators show that the interest in history is as strong as ever. Following TV programs about history, So I would say some of it comes from a sort of change of emphasis in school and a wider sort of zeitgeist on wishing to push back against this. The young are always rebellious, and
Yes,
you
that's
have
true. That's such a good
so
point.
so there's an element of this, and part of it's overturning their elders, sacred idols, and things like that. I do think that there is yet to be a sensible reckoning amongst the young in terms of some of Britain's relationships with its former colonies, in terms of that, and in terms of understanding that at this in 1900, lots of countries conquered lots of other countries all over the world, and it wasn't just the West doing it. It was Japan. It was also anyone who could, and we've actually changed a lot as a global society in terms of thinking that is not okay anymore. And of course, it's connected with things which we get sort of things coming across from the Atlantic on race and George Floyd, and other things which are not really connected to this can get caught up in that general sort of zeitgeist of wanting to protest. And race is very important for many young people. And of course, there are some real injustices there which need to be addressed, but equally looking back at certain things is not necessarily the most constructive or productive way to do so. I guess where I think it's important, though, is it is important to actually, as you say, take a holistic view of history and to recognize that history was populated by human individuals who were doing their best. And Churchill is colorful. I mean, he crossed the Houses of Commons multiple times. He had a very interesting life. No one ever said that Churchill was a sort of person who followed all the rules. That's not part of his character. But I sometimes wonder if we're becoming a slightly puritanical society amongst the young.
That's a very interesting point.
That sort of thing, that someone can have this colorful and career, there may be a bit less tolerance for that. And I'm not sure what would be driving what's driving that change, but I think that is perhaps part of it as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, tolerance is a bedrock pillar of a liberal society. And I was reading something the other day where I forget who it was. I always try to give credit where it's due, because these things are very important. But he was saying that intolerance that is actually to be tolerant breeds intolerance on the fringes. Because if you are giving space to diverse points of view and in multiple ways of perceiving things on the fringes, those things harden. And he was making the argument that actually the liberal democratic society has actually fomented intolerance due to its intense tolerance of multiple ideas, which is just a fascinating thing to think about in general. But to your point, Churchill, when we talk about Churchill, we talk about him, of course, talk about his leadership, his courage, his advocacy for democratic values around the world. But we also talk about the sense that he was a multifaceted man, and we encourage people to come to him in whatever way that they do, whether that be on accident through, he was an amateur painter and people really enjoy his paintings, or, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for literature. And but to your point, I feel like maybe it's the social media age, where if you need to get something in 280 characters on Twitter, you're going to pick the most aggressive and thing that this man did or said, and then that just perpetuates without any context around it. And do you find in your polling in the History Matters project that when institutions do provide context, that it is a much more richer engagement with the public, and that that's the public good that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it's something which we see again and again. I mean, there's no denying that the same attitudes which are driving wider societal polarization, whether that's social media, whether that's other matters, are also driving that same sort of polarization in our view of history. But again, absolutely, we do see that people want to have complex discussions. If you take the time, they want to be engaged. They want to see this happening in their schools, in their museums, in their public spaces. And one of the things that Policy Exchange recommended, and that the UK government has taken forward, is a retain and explain policy with regards to monuments, which is like, hey, we'll keep them. Sometimes you might add information. Sometimes you might put up another monument opposite it or beside it, or to show something else. And again, this goes down very, very well. People are interested in this, and people are interested in seeing how even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, people were debating the same kind of things that we're debating now. They were debating things like education and society and democracy and many other things from a different starting point, but they were still debating these matters. And every generation faces its challenges. I mean, the other thing I would say is that although we can be tempted to sort of sit here and wring our hands at the state of society or to worry about the young, I think if we take back to the subject of this at Churchill, if we think of the 20s and 30s, the challenges to democracy and to liberalism were far, far greater then than they are now. And we think, not just the external challenges of Germany and Japan and others, the challenges within society. There was the Great Depression, there was, real sort of flirting with fascism, with communism in a whole range of democratic societies to a far greater level than we're talking about today. And actually, we did overcome those. Our societies were robust enough to do so. And as long as we continue to champion those freedoms, freedom of association, freedom of speech, democratic debate, then actually the great thing about democracy isn't that it doesn't make mistakes, but that it's robust enough to correct those mistakes before they turn into disasters.
That's a very, very astute point. I completely agree with you. It's important to always remind people that it's been a lot worse. And the freedoms that you enjoy today are born out of the struggles and of the fledgling democracies in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. And my last comment is, from our point of view with Churchill, the invasion of Ukraine and President Zelensky's embodiment of his own type of leadership on behalf of the Ukrainian people, and really imitating and I don't mean that in a negative sense, and the example set by Churchill. I think that the invasion of Ukraine has actually kind of woken up this younger generation to a sense of, oh wow, war does happen, and there are bad entities, and there violence and death and destruction is only just a 2-hour flight away from London. And nuclear weapons are a real thing. In those times of crises, individual and collective leadership is so important. And actually, we've seen a lot of interest in Churchill's life, due to that invasion. So, in a sense, and in an awful, in an awful experience of what's going on in the world, it reinforces that we can look to the past to find inspiration for immediate present day conflicts. And that's why I don't think Churchill will ever be canceled, because it's too significant, to your point, that those principles, they'll go dormant for a while, and then they suddenly flare back to life.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we've seen something, it was at the time when our government was going through a lot of scandals around parties and things, but we saw a complete rallying around from all political persuasions on supplying arms to Ukraine, on taking in Ukrainian refugees. The Ukrainians themselves, and President Zelensky, have obviously been absolutely heroic in terms of what they have done. But actually, the West has come together as well to support them in accepting higher energy prices, which are causing real hardship to a lot of people, and paying and getting into more government debt in order to pay that to stand up for freedom. And I think you're right. I mean, Churchill ultimately, he stood for a lot of things, but ultimately he does stand for that spirit of freedom, and that's something which we can all recognize, and it will always be relevant.
Iain, thank you for your time. Thank you for conducting this poll, and kudos to you and your team for the History Matters project. And I know it's been many. You do this rolling comprehensive review, and it's fascinating. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.